what Gaza has done is to actually reveal the insecurities of international law and put international law at the fora, and also manifest the violence that really hides behind that liberal rhetoric. So the post-war world order, as we call it, that came with the establishment of the United Nations, sought to kind of create a clean slate of what would be the new rules of the game, so to speak. And those rules of the game were really built on the notion of colonial erasure. It is not that the United Nations started with recognizing that most of the world was under European colonization and being exploited to its core, with European corporations taking hold of the world. And in reality, that whole premises then came to normalize the supremacy, so to speak, of some powers over other powers. So it was very normal within that system to normalize the exploitation of the Congo, civil wars, intervention by states, the race to the bottom, and all of that. So it is as if the tolerance, so to speak, to these forms of atrocities, exploitation, domination, and subjugation were really written into the system. However, because it is a legal system and because it kind of tried to translate what we know as the European legal system, Western legal thought understood more broadly, which of course in its own turn is very sympathetic to capitalism and everything within that, it still had to uphold this facade, so to speak, of a claim to justice, and to be somewhat legitimized in front of the rest of the world, especially the quote unquote uncivilized world that sought to come into the civilized legal system by claiming that it does serve justice on some level or the other. This is what I call the insecurity of international law, whereby it represents itself under a veneer of justice, but in reality is very malleable to the interests of capital and power. So, but what happened with Gaza is that whole dynamic was put on the stage. The fact that some lives are worth more than others, the fact that the world order needs to remain as it is indeed there at the forefront and at the stage with Gaza. So here we're faced with very different understandings of what international law is meant to do. For some people, international law is meant to serve this premises for equality and, under its veneer, build on a world where we're all seen as human beings. But its reality is that it is in service of that power. And we find that tension really in our study of international law. So, mainstream liberal international lawyers would rather uphold the status quo and understand international peace and security as upholding the status quo at whichever cost. And in reality, this is just the very bloody manifestation of what otherwise would have been spoken in very nice words in international law conferences, wearing suits and saying that this is absolutely fine and we should tolerate this as human beings because this is the best option that we have. Another reading of international law can really be traced back to the 1950s and 60s, where, as Alvarez would say, a new international order was brewing with the decolonization, or not, we can't really actually call it decolonization as much as formal independence, so to speak, and the new age of neocolonialism coming to the fore in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And what Alvarez was trying to say, for example, in the Anglo Iranian oil case at the International Court of Justice, was that, well, if we are really serious about decolonization, then we should reimagine international law. It should not simply be a mirror of Western legal thought. It should just not simply be an understanding of international peace and security as the status quo. We should understand interdependence, histories of colonization, and we should recognize that within the rules. And then there was a series of resolutions that sought to take this forward. So, for example, the Declaration on Friendly Relations, the Declaration on Ending All Forms of Colonization, the New International Economic Order, they all sought to establish premises that try to evade very strict understanding of private property, for example, in Western legal thought. They were saying actually sovereignty over natural resources is more important than acquired rights by colonial corporations. margins. They're trying to say that non intervention is a primary principle to ascertain sovereignty, and states should not intervene in the internal politics of states of the global south that, of course, were under, at the time, consistent coups d'etats by imperial powers. So in this case, there was this very interesting, different reading of a new world order, so to speak, of international law. However, sadly, with Thatcher and Reagan coming to the fora in the 1980s, that project was killed. And international law was back on its status quo liberal framework. So here we find that actually it worked as it would have been expected, and critical lawyers were usually seen to be on the margins of the discipline were suddenly pushed towards the front in the sense that their warning of the workings of politics and colonial erasure in the deceiving and distorting nature of international law really came to light. And it is also very manifest in the fact that so many international lawyers were hesitant and still are hesitant to call things by their name, to condemn things, and are still capable of using very dehumanizing language and accepting of the fact that their own terminologies and works could be used to normalize one of the worst atrocities we have seen in the history of mankind, and indeed one that is quite insane in its magnitude as well as in its reality. The fact that we're witnessing a live streamed genocide where still the magic of international law is yet so strong that some people are still holding on to it. What Gaza has done is to actually reveal the insecurities of international law and put international law at the fora, and also manifest the violence that really hides behind that liberal rhetoric. On the 23rd of October 2023, a group of Palestinian representatives went to the UN Human Rights Commissioner, and we were all dressed in black, shocked. It was around the time of the Mahmadani hospital massacre. It was the first semblance of what will then become a long series of targeting of hospitals and patients. And we entered the office of the UN Human Rights Commissioner. We were greeted with smiles and asked to come into this room overlooking the beautiful mountains of Geneva. We sat down and we explained that without anchoring our analysis of the situation as a classic case of settler colonization that often does come with genocide as premised on the history of colonization as a whole, also adding to that the very factual evidence of the statements of Israeli officials, the level of the use of armaments, and all the different forms of evidence that lead to the very solid conclusion that over 800 scholars and international lawyers signed on at the time, noting that a genocide will happen in Gaza. We were met with a long silence that was then met with the question of, okay, what now? And what is your plan for the day after? So we were met with the whole liberal establishment accepting the risk, accepting the atrocity, and seeking to simply navigate it in humanitarian terms, rather than sounding the alarm and accepting our distress. In reality, what has happened ever since then is a long bureaucratic process of you're being mass murdered, please wait in line. At moments when we saw the most horrendous acts of humanity, of the largest cohort of amputated children in the whole world, over 15,000 children killed, let alone all the families devastated, let alone also the over 10,000 Palestinian prisoners under torture, and all of that horrendousness. And still, in the United Nations, we were asked over and over again to go through the bureaucratic procedures. And then we were always met with the most convoluted forms of language. Plausible genocide. It is conditions that might be calculated to bring about the destruction of a group. It was exactly the same aura that the BBC deals with the deaths of Palestinians, as if this death has to happen. And here again, we see the manifestation of this international legal order that is premised on colonial erasure and the normalization of the humanization of some people. Palestinians can only be victims, and response to them can only be humanitarian. So, to speak of words such as liberation and to speak of words that capture the settler colonial context here is completely foreign to the practitioners within that field. And what we said and the language that we were using was considered too emotional, perhaps, or unprofessional, or not fitting, because of course us too would have easily been the would have been the subjects of these bombs, and our lives would have been equally seen to be worthless. Nevertheless, over the generations, Palestinian scholars, as well as ally scholars from all across the Arab region, as well as the global south and the global north, have sought to strategically use international law. Again, going back to the personal story, as a young person who was born around the Second Intifada, I was myself quite moved at the time by my mother telling me that there are children. I grew up in Jordan, so very close by, who were just like yourself, were being killed. And that urge in me led me to end up becoming an international lawyer. And there are hundreds of people, if not over thousands, who had the same appeal. We were told that there is the system that serves some semblance of justice, and if you want to defend your people, then you need to have a voice. But then, once we arrived in these spaces, what we found was that these places were not indeed designed for us. They are built for us to prove our humanity over and over and over again until that eats up a part of our own souls. And nevertheless, now we have a group of people, and not just working on Palestine, working on the whole of the global south. The example of this could be third world approaches to international law as a movement, and critical scholars who are seeking to discursively engage with international law. So, this is what Noor Ariqat calls principled pragmatism, and what others like George Abi Saab and Mohammed Bijawi would call building on a global south led reading of international law that seeks to discursively overcome these limitations. In reality, we will only respect and recognize the legitimacy of these laws on the premises of that different reading of international law. And here becomes the very endless question, of course, of Audre Lorde, of whether or not we can use the master's tools. But in reality, here we're not using the master's tools, but rather building on the paradoxes within the master's tools that are built on this idea of justice, and then, of course, seek to maintain this liberal world order. So, what we do with that is that we actually seek to engage as scholars, as international lawyers, with that internal paradox, and always point to the fact that actually you cannot build an international legal order without the premises of equality, without non domination and non subjugation. And here I find that the sources of the writers from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, which is a very short window in the history of international law where there was very strong engagement by scholars of the global south in that ethos and that reading of international law. And but these are sources, and these sources are have been validated by the International Court of Justice, and no international lawyer can tell me that this is not an equally international law. So by building on documents like the Declaration of Friendly Relations, Declaration of Ending All Forms of Colonization, by going to the United Nations and asking for an advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice, which came 57 years after the start of the occupation. So that's, you can see how long it took the system to call things by what they are. And all that they told us is, oh, yes, this is an illegal occupation. But indeed, if we read what the International Court of Justice said in July 2024 in the advisory opinion on the legal consequences of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, we will actually find that the court is describing a classic case of colonization. What is a state that commits apartheid, and apartheid, which includes systematic racial segregation within the law, as well as annexation, as well as denial of self determination, as well as an endless list of violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, war crimes, crimes against humanity, you name it, Israel has done it. And yet, the International Court of Justice did not call things by their name. It called it an illegal occupation. However, no one can now deny that even by the rule of the highest court of the world, any Israeli foot inside of Gaza or the West Bank is inherently illegal. Palestinians have a legally recognized right of return even to historic Palestine and within what we now call Israel. And Palestinians have the right of reparations. The states have the duty to do everything within their capacity to stop the ongoing plausible genocide, and indeed to cooperate towards ending the illegal Israeli occupation. So these are all now strategic tools for us to use. It is as if that the system has reached a point where it can no longer uphold logic without listening. And this is exactly the moment when the global north has given up on international law. Only last week did the US Congress decide to give zero budget to the United Nations and dismantling of the International Criminal Court as we see it. It's as if the system could not really handle such a paradox or such a shock, even though it's still very minimal. It doesn't even aspire to reach the level of suffering that we are talking, and indeed about not just in the context of Palestine, but in the context of Sudan, the Congo, you name it, it is happening there as well. And so in this case, perhaps the question always happen. The question that we go back to isn't the question of what will international law do to Palestine, but rather what is Palestine doing to international law. So we are very steadfast in maintaining not only our advocacy for Palestine, but rather actually our advocacy and leading on using the case of Palestine as a clear case of justice without black or white to reignite or build the premises for a global south reading of international law, a reading that is directly premised on equality, non-domination, and non-subjugation. So as we advocate for that reading of international law, that's the only way that we could hold true to the cause of Palestinian liberation. And indeed, for example, you can see that now the debate on the right to resist, whereby in the liberal spaces of international law, the right to resist is something that we do not speak of. However, we can indeed find very strong General Assembly resolutions that reiterate the right to resist by all means available over and over and over again. Even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that we need to protect human rights lest people rebel again and ask for their rights in their own hands. So by pointing out to these contradictions, the system itself is collapsing. We do not know if this will lead to Palestinian liberation indeed. However, we would like to think of this as one front, let's say, of legal liberation project, more understood more broadly. The strategy here is not short term, but rather very much long term, because the beast that we are met with is indeed unfathomable and quite big. And the vision that we have has to be, by its nature, rather idealistic and a vision of that of dreamers, rather than falling into the real politique that asks us to give up a part of this idealism or that perception of the law. So perhaps holding on to the cause of Palestinian liberation indeed requires, at least on the international legal liberation front, I wouldn't say that for other fronts, maintaining an idealistic, so to speak, engagement with the notion of justice, even if that, and understanding that even on personal levels will cost us so much of our own privileges and our own capacities, and accepting that, and using every single space to bring out these paradoxes, and also maintaining our mental capacity while navigating an endless bureaucracy, and not letting that bureaucracy make us lose sight of the reality of which we speak, grounding ourselves in the relevant reality of that international law in its very nice buildings has really steered away from. As to the question of what is it that we advise people to do, as of now, the primary asks are as follows. So, first and foremost, with regards to the ongoing genocide, it is the direct access of aid as per the impartial principles of humanitarian aid. And there's currently a campaign to support a diplomatic convoy to enter Gaza, whereby states pledge to send diplomatic representatives, and that plan seeks to counteract Israel's plan to let to administer the aid in Gaza. So that's currently our number one priority. For those interested in that, they can review the online pages of Law for Palestine that do give you indications of how to support that campaign by lobbying your state, informing your MPs, supporting and publishing about it. That's the primary point. The other points that we are working towards, of course, and indeed building on the relevant precedents that we have, starts with a three-way arms embargo against Israel: no buying, no selling, no transferring; energy embargo against Israel; unseating Israel from the United Nations and different parts of the United Nations, of course; and accountability for the Palestinian people, as well as reparations, and pursuing states in order to facilitate litigation and cases against atrocity crimes. So we need prosecutors in states who would be sympathetic to cases that prosecute mass atrocity and people who are responsible for that. So the first question to ask yourself is really, what is it best that you do? If you work in the media, then support there. If you're a health worker, then focus on the health workers campaigns. If you're a teacher, then create more content to teach people. It really starts with your point of strength. The second question is, find out what are your own local networks and communities. There's Palestine solidarity campaigns all across the world. There are BDS campaigns, but there are also other campaigns that you could join. And working unified in voices is very important. And for those who are already a part of communities, seeking to unify your voice with other communities is also very important. Reaching out and ensuring that we all have a unified position and approach and tactics towards things, that will really make our voices much stronger. And perhaps this is one of the most important messages out there. Ensure that you understand this, and not just understand the history of Palestine, but rather keep in mind how this is a continuation of a long trajectory of colonial histories. Palestine is just a contemporary case of colonization that is here to remind us of what history has looked like. People have been in concentration camps, not just in the Holocaust, but in Namibia, in South Africa, in Algeria, in Libya, in the Congo. These are the shared histories of humankind that have been erased. And the moment we understand that, we're better capable of also facilitating consciousness among the masses in order to move, not again just for justice for Palestinians, but rather to evade what seems to be like a very dark turn that we're currently taking with the rearming of Europe and the normalization and acceptance of something as insane as a live stream genocide. And of course, boycott is an important thing, the usage of applications, as well as indeed activism against corporations that benefit from the genocide. Keep an eye on Palestinian civil society and what they say: Al Haq, Al Mizan, as well as PCHR, the account of Francesca Albanese, Majd Kayal, and Majd Al Kurd. So all of these names would really help you keep yourself informed, but also give you spaces for action going forward. So the Hague Group is a group of states that came together from the global south, including Malaysia, Colombia, Cuba, to come together with a declaration in order to uphold international law. So here we can see the ultimate paradoxes of international law, in the sense that states are coming together only to say that we seek to uphold international law as is. So these states came together with a public declaration in support of Palestine, which in the current geopolitical context is a big gamble, since any state that speaks out in support of Palestine, for example, South Africa, which is in the Hague Group, has seen a lot of economic repercussions by imperial powers. So the initiative of the Hague Group seeks to first unify the voice and the strategy of these states in order to counteract the force of imperial powers, but also as a shared initiative of humanity towards the Palestinian people. These states have also made commitments towards not selling and not buying weapons from Israel, so an arms embargo. And they're also seeking to support the Palestinian cause and community in different ways. What we are facing with the Hague Group is limitations of diplomatic capacity, the usual spaces of that, as well as the limitation of the Palestinian representation, being the Palestinian Authority, which, for those who do not know, does not represent the Palestinian people. It's a classic neo-colonial power that puts the Palestinians in a paradox. So, in general, there's a lot of limitations on engaging with Palestine on diplomatic level, either that's prompted either by the Palestinian Authority itself or by the norms of global diplomatic relations. However, what we are hoping to see is more states joining the Hague Group, because the more states are there, the more we're able to unify voices, and the states within the Hague Group are able to better protect themselves from the repercussions that they would face. As we face the tumbling down of international law, perhaps now what we could see and start to build are the building blocks of what is to come in the future. And how is it that we are able to build the premises for a new international order? So, initiatives like the Hague Group that seek to unify state voices and uphold some level of a reading of international law that refuses mass atrocity is indeed the way forward. Furthermore, it is a global south led initiative, which we would like to see way much more of. The global south is the global majority, and sadly enough, for generations, governments have not been representative of their people thanks to imperial powers. So now, with the rise of a few governments that have some representative capacity, though very little, we can hope to see some unification and some strength. Historically speaking, there was the non aligned movement, for example. There was the Bandung Conference. There were spaces where states of the global south sought to come with each other and enshrine some premises of equality in their approach to international legal order. So, as for what you could do, I highly encourage you to start writing to your MPs and asking them, that is, your parliamentary members, and encouraging them to ask their government, why are you not joining the Hague Group? Especially that the Hague Group is such a small basic ask in comparison to how far state international obligations are in according to international law. An arms embargo isn't just something that a state chooses to do. It is an international legal obligation. It's an erga omnes legal obligation premised on the violation of the highest rules of international law. So actually, in this case, joining the Hague Group becomes a move towards upholding some level of an international legal order, and it becomes a move towards that if they want to do that, and if they want to maintain that level of discourse. So we still are very much encouraging people to join and encouraging people to learn more about the Hague Group, and those in the Hague Group to lobby their states to take on more commitments as far as they can. And especially if you're in small states that we still haven't reached, we really need as many voices as possible, keeping that on your agendas when you protest and when you communicate with state officials.